So there I was, chillin' in my backyard, having a beer with Bartholomew. That's my gnome, by the way, don't judge, when this presence descends upon my lawn like a freakin' beige storm cloud, ruining my perfectly good afternoon. You know the type. HOA Karen. I'm Reggie, by the way. Reggie Johnson. And I like my peace and quiet. I like my backyard. I like a cold beer on a Saturday afternoon. And yeah, I like my freaking gnome. What's it to ya? I ain't hurting nobody. I'm just a dude trying to enjoy the little patch of grass I pay an absurd amount of money for, but in Pleasant View Meadows, and I use that name very loosely. Even a little bit of individuality is apparently a freaking crime against humanity, or at least against the Homeowners Association. Now, Bartholomew ain't your average run-of-the-mill garden gnome. He's special. He's about 2 feet tall, got this ridiculously oversized pointy hat, and he's riding a freaking flamingo. Yeah, you heard me right. A flamingo. It's glorious. It's majestic. It's my kind of weird. I found him at a flea market a few years back, and it was love at first sight. He's been my backyard buddy ever since. We have conversations, don't judge. But Karen. Oh, Karen. She didn't see the beauty in Bartholomew. She didn't appreciate his unique charm. She saw a threat. She stood there, on the edge of my lawn, looking like she'd just sucked on a lemon dipped in vinegar. Her face was all pinched up, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. And she was holding a clipboard, of course, because Karens always have clipboards. It's like their weapon of choice. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a winter wind. "We need to talk about that." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Bartholomew, like he was some kinda contaminated thing. "What's up, Karen?" I said, taking a long swig of my beer. "Bartholomew giving you the stink eye again?" "This is serious, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "That object is in violation of multiple HOA regulations. It's tacky. It's unbecoming. It's lowering property values." "Lowering property values," I repeated, looking around at my perfectly respectable yard. "It's a gnome, Karen. It's not like I've got a junkyard full of rusty cars out here." "It's disturbing the peace," she continued, ignoring my perfectly reasonable argument. "It's attracting undesirables." "Undesirables?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Like what? Other gnomes? You think Bartholomew's gonna start a freaking gnome gang?" She also claimed it was scaring the children, and that she had a list of complaints. "It's simply not appropriate, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "We have standards in Pleasant View Meadows, and your gnome does not meet those standards." "Standards?" I said, taking another swig of my beer. "What standards are those, Karen? The no fun allowed standards? The beige is the only acceptable color standards? The conformity is king standards?" "The community standards, Mr. Johnson," she said with a sniff. "The standards that ensure Pleasant View Meadows remains a pleasant place to live." "Pleasant for who, Karen?" I asked. "For you? For the other clipboard-wielding joy killers? 'Cause I gotta tell you, Bartholomew ain't hurting nobody. He's just chillin' on my lawn, riding his flamingo, bringing a little bit of weirdness to this otherwise sterile freakin' neighborhood." She just stared at me, her lips pressed so tightly together they almost disappeared. Then, she pulled out a piece of paper from her clipboard. "This is an official HOA violation notice, Mr. Johnson," she said, thrusting it at me. "You have 7 days to remove the offending object. Failure to comply will result in a fine and further action." "Further action? What were they gonna do? Send in the freaking SWAT team to confiscate my gnome?" I took the notice, looking it over. Violation of Community Aesthetic Guidelines, it read. Garden ornament deemed inappropriate and detrimental to the overall appearance of the neighborhood. You are hereby ordered to remove said ornament. This woman, right? She's got a problem with a gnome. A freaking ceramic gnome. Like it's gonna, I don't know, start a gnome uprising and overthrow the government, or corrupt the youth, or single-handedly destroy the freaking fabric of society. These people, man. So you're telling me, I said, looking up at Karen, that my gnome, my harmless flamingo-riding gnome, is a threat to the integrity of Pleasant View Meadows? It is, she said, her voice firm, and it must be removed. Well, Karen, I said, taking a deep breath, I'm gonna have to respectfully disagree. You're making a mistake, Mr. Johnson, she said, her eyes narrowing. The HOA will not tolerate this kind of insubordination. Insubordination? I repeated, laughing. It's a gnome, Karen. It's not a freaking military coup. But she just turned and walked away, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hand, leaving me standing there, staring at the violation notice and wondering what the hell I was going to do. Of course, they called a meeting, an emergency HOA meeting, to discuss my gnome. I walked into that meeting looking like a freaking lion, walking into a den of Karens. The room was filled with the usual suspects. The HOA board members, all looking like they'd just stepped out of a Land's End catalog, and a bunch of other residents, most of them looking either bored or mildly annoyed. And there, at the front of the room, was Karen, looking like the freaking queen of the killjoys. Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice all sweet and sickly, like she was talking to a particularly dense child, your gnome has been brought to our attention. My gnome, I said, keeping my voice even, is a garden ornament, Karen. It's decorative. It's harmless. It's tacky, Mr. Johnson, she declared, her voice rising in pitch. It's unbecoming. It's a violation of community standards. She held up a handful of printed emails. She went on and on, claiming Bartholomew was attracting negative energy and, I swear to God, violating the feng shui of the neighborhood. Like a freaking gnome could disrupt the cosmic balance of Pleasant View Meadows. It's not even Halloween, one woman cried. It's my property, Karen, I said, trying to reason with her. I should be able to put whatever I want in my yard as long as it's not, illegal. But it's offensive, she insisted. It's disturbing. It's just wrong. It's a gnome, Karen, I repeated, my voice getting louder. It's not like I'm, sacrificing chickens in my backyard, or building a freaking meth lab. It's a gnome riding a flamingo. What's so freaking offensive about that? The other board members, they just sat there, mostly nodding along with Karen like a bunch of freaking bobbleheads. Except for this one dude, older guy, in the back, who looked like he was trying not to laugh. I gave him a little nod. He winked. My man. But Karen, she was on a roll. She went on and on about community standards and property values, and maintaining a cohesive aesthetic. It was like she was reading from the freaking HOA handbook for how to be a complete and utter pain in the ass. We have rules, Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice like ice. And those rules must be followed. The gnome must go. And then the hammer dropped. The board, under Karen's iron fist, or should I say iron clipboard, voted unanimously, except for my man in the back, bless his soul, to uphold the violation. I was ordered to remove Bartholomew within 7 days, and, to add insult to injury, I was fined for having a gnome I walked out of that meeting, steam practically coming out of my ears. 7 days, huh? 7 days to remove my beloved Bartholomew? Oh, hell no. Karen and her HOA cronies thought they could push me around. They thought they could tell me what to do with my own freaking property. They had another thing coming. And that thing was gonna be prehistoric. 7 days. That's all the time Karen and her beige-loving bureaucrats gave me to remove Bartholomew, my gnome, my flamingo-riding gnome. 7 days to get rid of a perfectly harmless, undeniably quirky, and, in my opinion, charming piece of garden art. Like hell I was gonna do that. I, Reggie Johnson, was not a remover of gnomes. I was a defender of gnomes. A champion of, well, of weird yard stuff. And I wasn't about to let Karen win. This wasn't just about Bartholomew anymore. It was about principle. It was about the right to express yourself, to have a little fun, to have a freaking gnome riding a flamingo in your front yard without getting harassed by the HOA. They want to play games? I ranted to myself, pacing my living room like a caged animal. Oh, I'll play games. I'll show 'em what a real yard decoration looks like. I'll show 'em what happens when you mess with a man and his gnome. I was mad, man, furious. But beneath the anger, there was this spark. A spark of mischief, of inspiration. I wasn't just gonna fight back, I was gonna escalate. I was gonna go so far over the top, so freaking ridiculous, that Karen's head would spin right off her perfectly coiffed shoulders. And of course, they were planning on enacting new rules to cover yard decorations. But first, I needed a plan, a loophole, a way to stick it to the HOA legally. My weapon of choice? The internet, baby. And of course, the freaking HOA bylaws. That Bible of boredom, that testament to tyranny. It held the key to my victory. I just had to find it. I started digging. HOA rules, local ordinances, property rights. And then, because my brain works in mysterious ways, I started researching fossils. Yeah, you heard me right. Fossils, dinosaurs, prehistoric crap. Why? I don't know, man. It just came to me. Like a freaking revelation. And then, bam! There it was, staring me right in the face. The loophole, the golden ticket, the get out of HOA jail free card. See, the HOA, in their infinite wisdom, had all these rules about garden ornaments and decorative objects. They had size restrictions, appropriateness guidelines, the whole 9 yards. But they didn't say nothing about fossils? Or skeletons? Or life-sized dinosaur replicas? And there was this other little gem, tucked away in the section on community enhancement projects. Installations that promote educational opportunities and enhance the understanding of history or science may be considered for approval. Educational opportunities, history, science, dinosaurs. It was freaking perfect. A slow, evil grin spread across my face. Fossils, huh? I muttered. Oh, I'll give 'em fossils. Operation Dynamite was born. My plan was insane. Beautifully, gloriously insane. I wasn't just going to ignore the HOA's order to remove Bartholomew. I was going to bury him. Figuratively speaking, of course. I was going to bury him under a freaking mountain of prehistoric awesomeness. I was going to install a life-size dinosaur skeleton in my yard. Yeah, you heard me right. A dinosaur skeleton. Not a little one either. I'm talking big. I'm talking imposing. I'm talking a freaking T-Rex, baby. Or maybe a Triceratops. Or, hell, why not a pterodactyl, suspended from a freaking tree? It had to be huge, though. It had to dominate the landscape. It had to make Karen's head explode. And I'd argue, with a perfectly straight face, that it wasn't a garden ornament. Oh no, it was an educational exhibit. A paleontological display. A tribute to the wonders of science and the history of life on Earth, and therefore completely exempt from the HOA's stupid rules about Gnomes. I could already picture Karen's reaction. The sputtering, the outrage, the sheer unadulterated horror. It was going to be biblical. This wasn't just about a gnome anymore. It was about freedom. It was about the right to be weird, to be creative, to have a freaking dinosaur skeleton in your front yard if you felt like it. I knew it was ridiculous. I knew it was probably going to cost me a fortune. But, god damn it, it was worth it. It was time to unleash the inner paleontologist. I didn't even know I had. First step, make sure I'm not going to end up in actual jail. I checked the city ordinances. Nothing about dinosaur skeletons. Nothing about paleontological displays. I was in the clear. As long as it didn't, block the sidewalk or fall on somebody's house, I was good to go. Next, I needed a dinosaur, a big one. I started searching online. And holy crap, you can buy anything on the internet. I found this company, Prehistoric Props, that specialized in life-sized dinosaur skeletons. They had everything, man. T-Rex, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Velociraptors, even a freaking Brachiosaurus, though that one was a little out of my price range. I ended up talking to this guy, the owner, named, you guessed it, Bob. Seriously, what is it with Bob's and my HOA problems? So, let me get this straight, Bob said, his voice a mix of amusement and disbelief. You want a life-sized dinosaur skeleton for your front yard? Because your HOA doesn't like your gnome. That's the gist of it, Bob, I said. Think big, think imposing, think the most epic, HOA-defying dinosaur skeleton you can find. And, I added with a grin, make sure it's anatomically correct. I want it to be educational. Bob started laughing. Dude, you are my freaking idol. This is the best request I've ever gotten. You know these things are usually for, museums, right? Or theme parks? Yeah, well, I said, consider my front yard a theme park. The theme is screw the HOA. We settled on a T-Rex. Classic, iconic, and freaking huge. Bob assured me it was made of durable, weather-resistant materials. Gotta withstand those HOA inspections, you know. And that it could be assembled on-site. He even offered to throw in a few extras. Some smaller dinosaur skeletons, some fake fossils, maybe even a volcano. I nixed the volcano. Even I have limits. And so, Operation Dynamite commenced. It was like a freaking paleontological circus. Came to town. Trucks arrived carrying these massive crates labeled Handle with Care, T-Rex Skeleton. I swear, the whole neighborhood was standing on their lawns watching, jaws dropped, eyes popping out of their sockets. It was beautiful. A team of workers, looking like they were assembling a freaking space shuttle, started unloading the crates. There were bones, man. Giant bones. Ribs the size of freaking surfboards. A skull bigger than my car. It was insane. They started putting this thing together, piece by piece, right there in my front yard. It was like watching a prehistoric jigsaw puzzle, only with more cranes and power tools and, with a lot more screaming from Karen, who I could see peeking through her curtains, looking like she was about to have a freaking aneurysm. The neighbors, man, they were loving it. Some of them were laughing, some of them were taking pictures, some of them were just shaking their heads in disbelief, but they were all entertained. And that, my friends, is what it's all about. My internal monologue was a constant stream of, "Take that, Karen," and "Oh, this is so worth it," and "I wonder if I can get a saddle for this thing." There was, of course, the obligatory HOA inspection. Mr. Snootwell, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past few days, showed up with his freaking clipboard and his measuring tape. Seriously, what is it with these people and measuring tapes? "Mr. Johnson?" he stammered, staring up at the partially assembled T-Rex skeleton, his voice barely a whisper. "What in the hell is this?" It's an educational exhibit, Mr. Snootwell, I said, all calm and innocent. A paleontological display. You know, for the kids. Gotta teach 'em about dinosaurs and science and the Mesozoic era. But it's a dinosaur, he sputtered, pointing at the giant skeleton. A giant dinosaur? It's a Tyrannosaurus rex, Mr. Snootwell, I corrected. And, as you can see, I added, pulling out a copy of my city-approved building permit and the still relevant HOA bylaws, it's perfectly compliant. No rules against fossils or skeletons or extinct megafauna. It's educational. He looked at the permit, then at the dinosaur, then back at me. He knew he was beat. He mumbled something about consulting with the board and retreated, looking like he was about to freaking cry. And as I watched that T-Rex skeleton rise from my front yard, man, I felt like a freaking king. A king of, well, of dinosaurs. And of HOA defiance. It was gonna be epic. It was gonna be legendary. It was gonna be the most glorious, ridiculous middle finger to Karen and her freaking gnome that the world had ever seen. The unveiling of my T-Rex skeleton. Rexy, as I'd started calling him, was a moment for the ages. Or, at least, for the ages of Pleasant View Meadows. There it stood, in my front yard, in all its skeletal glory, 40 feet long, 20 feet high. A freaking apex predator made of, mostly, fiberglass and steel. It was magnificent. It was ridiculous. It was the perfect weapon against Karen and her HOA tyranny. And, speak of the devil, here she comes. Karen's arrival was, shall we say, dramatic. She practically flew across the street, her sensible shoes skidding on the pavement, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "What?" she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that probably shattered glass in neighboring counties. "Have you done?" I was standing in front of Rexy, wearing a safari hat and holding a fake fossil brush, because why not? Looking all calm and collected. "Morning, Karen," I said, my voice dripping with mock politeness. "Admiring my educational exhibit, I see?" "Educational exhibit," she sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at the giant skeleton. This is unthinkable. You've turned your yard into a dinosaur graveyard." "It's a paleontological display, Karen," I corrected, with a perfectly straight face. "A tribute to the wonders of science and the history of life on Earth. It's educational? You know, science? Ever heard of it?" "It's a monster, Johnson," she yelled, her eyes bulging. It's hideous. It's scaring the children." "The children love it, Karen," I countered, gesturing towards a group of kids who were gathered near the fence, gazing up at Rexy with awe and excitement. "They're learning about dinosaurs. They're expanding their minds. They're not staring at their freaking phones for once." "It's lowering property values," she insisted. "It's attracting undesirables. It's a blatant disregard for community standards." "It's a dinosaur skeleton, Karen," I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. "It's not like I'm, I don't know, running a meth lab out here. And, I might add," I continued, pulling out a copy of the HOA bylaws, which, by this point, I knew by heart. It's perfectly legal. No rules against fossils, or skeletons, or extinct megafauna. It's educational. Karen just stood there, speechless, her mouth open and closing like a freaking goldfish that just realized it's in a tank with a shark. I'll stop you, Johnson," she finally managed to choke out, her voice hoarse with rage. "I'll have this thing removed. You'll see, this isn't over." "Merry Christmas, Karen," I said. "And good luck with that." She turned and stomped off, muttering about lawyers, lawsuits, and the imminent collapse of civilization as we know it. I watched her go, then turned back to Rexy and grinned. It was on. The emergency HOA meeting, Part 2, the Dino disaster, was, and I say this with all due respect, a freaking shit show. Karen, looking like she hadn't slept in days, probably because she'd been too busy having nightmares about giant lizards, was in full-blown panic mode. And of course the HOA passed a new bylaw to try and stop me. This Jurassic Yard, she declared, her voice shaking with outrage, is an affront to everything Pleasant View Meadows stands for. It's a safety hazard. It's an eyesore. It's attracting tourists. This last part was actually true. People were driving from miles around to see my T-Rex. She'd even brought in a paleontologist, some guy in a khaki vest who looked suspiciously like her gardener, who testified about the unscientific nature of my display and the negative impact of inaccurate dinosaur representations on, well, on everything. Then it was my turn. Karen, I began, addressing the board, who, by this point, looked like they were regretting every life choice that had led them to this moment. Seems to be under the impression that I've somehow broken the rules, but at the time I hadn't. I laid it out for him, nice and slow. I cited the previous bylaws, showing him that there was nothing, not a single freaking word about dinosaur skeletons. I argued that my paleontological display was educational, that it was enhancing the community's understanding of science and history, and that it was, technically, just a really, really elaborate yard decoration. I even presented some research I'd done, aka I printed out some stuff from Wikipedia, talking about the educational benefits of dinosaur exhibits and how they spark kids' imaginations. And, just for good measure, I brought in some of the neighborhood kids who testified about how much they loved the dinosaur. They talked about how cool it was, how they learned so much about dinosaurs, and how they wanted to be paleontologists when they grew up. The board members, man, they were sweating. Some of them were still on Karen's side, nodding along like bobbleheads. But the others, they were starting to crack. They looked at the kids, they looked at the fake research, they looked at Karen, who was practically vibrating with rage, and they started to realize this whole thing was freaking insane. Then, a guy in the back, a local science teacher, stands up. "Look," he says, "I'm not gonna lie. This thing it's ridiculous, but it's also kinda awesome. And you know what? The kids are learning something. They're excited about science. And that's a good thing, right?" That was it. The final nail in Karen's coffin. The board, seeing the public relations disaster looming and probably terrified of getting sued, voted to do nothing. They couldn't enforce their new rule. Karen's authority? Freaking shattered. The meeting ended with her screaming about the end of the world, and me walking out with a grin so big it could have swallowed a freaking garden gnome. But Karen, she wasn't giving up. No way. This was war. The Dino Wars, that's what I called it. And it was epic. Karen, she tried everything to get rid of Rexy. She filed complaints with the city, zoning violations, safety hazards, noise complaints. Apparently, the T-Rex was roaring too loudly. The city inspectors, they came, they saw, they laughed. "This thing's awesome," one of them said, snapping a picture with his phone. She tried to get a petition going, went door to door telling people my dinosaur was gonna, I don't know, eat their children or something. You know how many signatures she got? 0. Zilch. Nada. People loved Rexy. They were bringing their kids to see him, taking pictures, even leaving little offerings at his feet, mostly toy dinosaurs and plastic bones. She even, I swear to God, tried to vandalize him. One night, I caught her on my security cameras, sneaking around with a can of spray paint. She was gonna, what? deface a freaking fiberglass dinosaur? I got that footage, by the way. It's going straight to YouTube. And me? I just kept adding to the spectacle. I put up educational signage around Rexy, with fun facts about dinosaurs and, of course, some subtle digs at the HOA. Tyrannosaurus rex, apex predator, feared by all, except for one very persistent Karen. I installed mood lighting. Spotlights, colored lights, the whole 9 yards. At night, Rexy looked like he was about to freaking stomp through the neighborhood. I built a fossil dig area for the kids. A big sandbox filled with buried plastic dinosaur bones. They could dig 'em up, play paleontologist, and, learn something while they were at it. And, because why the hell not, I hosted a Dino Days event. I invited the whole freaking neighborhood, except Karen, obviously, put up decorations, balloons, streamers, a banner that read, "Welcome to Jurassic Yard," and even hired a guy to dress up as a freaking dinosaur. We had games, food, music. It was a party, man. A party for a dinosaur. I even set up a booth and started charging admission for a tour. It was a freaking montage of escalating absurdity, man. Karen was losing her mind. The neighborhood was loving it. And Rexy? Rexy was just standing there, looking majestic as hell. A giant, prehistoric middle finger to the HOA. And I, Reggie Johnson, was the freaking dinosaur king of Pleasant View Meadows.